Counting double-digit thousands stacks.
Okay, so to continue, now coming back to the Git. So in the screen, if you see, there are two images, right? So on the left hand side, whatever that you see is what I was explaining you so far. So now all the other tools, that is Subversion, Clear Case, or Perforce, whatever that people use, basically it works on a centralized model. So what do you mean by centralized model? So centralized model is nothing but a place where you have one common server, and in that server you will be storing all the files. Okay, so that is what we call it as the centralized model. So now in this model you will be having one server where you store all the repositories, and all the users who do the changes, it will be on this repository, and each user on his own computer, he will be creating a workspace, and in that he will be doing the changes. Okay, now the problem with these kind of methodology that you're going to adapt is, now if you see here, whatever operations that you have to do, it has to go through the network, through the client to the server, because always server will be on a different machine, on a different location, and user might be on a different location. So that is when you will see that it takes a lot of time to complete the action. So if you as a user try to do a checkout or check-in, it will have to go through the network to the server and get the files and come back. So that is when, if you have a larger project and if you want to do a checkout of that, which is nothing but you want to see the contents of a particular repository, it will take at least 30 to 40 minutes to just create a workspace and do the checkout step, through which you will be able to see the content without even doing any change. Just to create a workspace, it will take an hour. So now taking an hour in my case will be a biggest problem to do the automation. So that is when the concept of centralized model will not work. Let's take another example where when you are working, if there is a network issue and if you are not able to connect to the server, then once again you cannot store any changes what you have done. So unless and until there is no network, you still cannot do any change. So that is one more drawback of the centralized model. Okay, now not only that, if a user has done some change and by mistake he tried to do the check-in, wherein after doing the check-in he realized that there is some problem and he didn't want to do that check-in or commit. So in that way it is not possible to keep a backup first and store, because anything that you do directly from a workspace, it will be directly going to the central repository and store. So that is when the user has to be more cautious, and any changes that they do will be directly be affected in the central server. So to overcome these things, when we work on Git, first thing that you need to know is Git doesn't work on a normal centralized model. So what do you mean by Git doesn't use a centralized model? Simply, in Git, you do not have a server and a client concept. That is the first thing. So if you see here, this is on a regular SCM tool, but in Git, there is no concept of server at all, or there is no concept of client. So if you say that, the next question that will come is, if you say there is no concept of server and client, then where are you going to store all the files and all the repositories? So that is when the first thing that you need to remember and understand in Git is, in Git, everything is a workspace, and every workspace will have a copy of the repository. So unlike other tools, in your workspace in Git, you will be able to see the files, as well as you will have a copy of the entire repository itself in your workspace. So the advantage of having the entire repository itself in your workspace. Now, let's say this is a workspace. In this workspace, you will be seeing the files, as well as you will be having the repository where it will be storing all the metadata information and all the version information. So if you do a check-in or a commit now, it will try to store in the repository on your own workspace. So whatever actions that you perform will be very fast in terms of storing, right? Because the repository where you want to store and get some details is available on your workspace itself. So that is the first advantage where you can get the things faster. Now, once again, if a user has to do some operation, first he will be doing it in his own local workspace, and you have all the rights of it, because what is workspace? It is just a directory basically. So now in that way, if you create a workspace, you will be owning that directory. So you will have all the permission that is needed for you to do any kind of activity. So it will be easy for the developers to do automation in a better way. And not only that, now let's go back to a scenario where if you're working on a group for the project, if you do some change, and if someone else want to take or share your change, what is that we have to do? So let's say that there is one user and there is another user. In this case, if this user has done the change and if he wants to share it with the other fellow, first thing he has to do is he has to do a check-in into the central repository, and from this central repository, this user has to do a checkout so that he will get everything. So this is again going to take a lot of time. But in this, since this workspace has a copy of the repository and this workspace has its own copy of the repository, whatever you store and do the modification will be stored and maintained in this repository local to this workspace. In the same way, anything that this user does on his workspace will be stored in the repository which is inside the workspace of his place. So now, if this person wants to share his change, he can directly share his change from his repository to the other person's workspace or repository. So it will be easy to transfer the or share the details. Now, in the same way, if you think on a broader picture, it is not just one user who will be working on the project or two users. What if you have 50 developers who are part of the development activity of the project? Then you don't know with whom you want to share, and it's once again, sharing the contents with many users is also not a good practice, because you need to give access permission on who should be accessing and who should not be accessing, right? So that is when we can adopt the concept of centralized model, where along with these user workspace, we will create one more copy of the workspace, where this workspace will act as a central workspace. And the purpose of that workspace is only to store the changes, nothing else. Wherein these workspaces which the users use, here they will be doing the modifications, and they will first do the checking here, and later when they want it to be shared to others, rather than they going and finding out who exactly wants the change, they will be just sharing the change from their local workspace to the central workspace. So that now, if anyone else on the project who is working and they want to know if any user has done the modification, they will directly go to the central repository or the workspace, and they will try to get a copy of that files, or they will do the checkout from this place. So that is how this way of working, where if needed you can share it with any other user directly, or if needed you will maintain a separate copy called central workspace, where this will be used only for storing and sharing the change, whereas here you will do the modification and as well as store the change. So this way of working is what we call it as a distributed model, and hence